perception. After sketching out the problems faced by these accounts, I shall try to recreate one elaborate argument given by Abhinav Gupta against the analogical argument for our knowledge of other minds, to the effect that even in another's body, one can feel and recognize one's own self by means of an imaginative perceptual process. In the recent excitement in neuroscience centering mirror neurons, putatively accounting for newborn children's mimicry, successful imitation of adult facial gestures, one may be tempted to see a corroboration of the almost innate mind-reading ability of humans. Abhinav Gupta, of course, pays a lot of attention to the performance of the vocative sambodhana in addressing the other as a you, tvam. The otherness of you does not take away from the second person's subjectivity. In that sense, just as every second person to whom one could speak is first a person, she is also a first person. Even as I regret, I do not know exactly what, for example, my closest friend right in front of me is now feeling. Even if I regret philosophically that I cannot quite feel that, I must have some general access to the subjective experience of that other person, for otherwise, and in essence, this last part of my sentence is the tagline which summarizes my entire lecture today, which is inspired by Wittgenstein and Abhinav Gupta. Otherwise, what is it that I feel so painfully to be missing, not feeling, to use Nyaya terminology, if I am apprehending an absence of the direct subjective knowledge of what she is feeling? Without knowledge of Pratyogin, an absence cannot be apprehended. So I must have got some vague, maybe a Jnana Lakshana, peculiar Alaukika awareness of the precise feeling that I feel that I am missing. I shall try to recreate one argument given by Abhinav Gupta to the effect that even in another's body, one can feel and recognize one's own self if one is able to address that embodied person as a you. And thus, perhaps our most primitive grasp of the notion of myself is as a you of you. You and I, we could perceive and transact with objects and events in a common world outside by what Davidson calls triangulation, only thanks to our being two distinct centers, but of one and the same subjectivity. Still, even at the emotional level, the I is always in trouble, insofar as it at once embraces and repels a you. Cannot, this is Kant's language, Immanuel Kant's language, cannot bear the other person, but cannot bear to be without her. That great mentor of European modernity, Immanuel Kant, gave voice to this logical emotional conflict of desires by calling it the unsocial sociability of man. It is well known that solipsism is one view that can neither expect endorsement from a fellow solipsist nor acknowledge disagreement with another, because there is no other mind, according to solipsist. There's a funny incident related in Bertrand Russell's autobiography that after he wrote an article defending that I and my ideas are the only thing that exists in the world, solipsism, an American learned lady wrote him a letter. You are a solipsist, I'm a solipsist too. And Russell wrote back, I'm very disappointed. Yet, in spite of such logical awkwardness, each of us, independently of the use of the first person singular pronoun, at least in certain pensive situations, feel imprisoned in a solitary bubble, and yet in other situations feel corrigibly, fallibly assured that we know exactly how the other person is feeling. Conflict again. Now, the analogical argument uh, from John Stuart Mill in 1872, he wrote this argument in his book called Examination of Sir William Hamilton's Philosophy. And backtracking to Dharmakirti, how do I know that another person is overjoyed or outraged, amazed or afraid? The classical answer, repeated by Dharmakirti, is the argument from analogy. And this is 7th century Buddhist epistemologist Dharmakirti says in a nutshell in his major epistemology text, Pramanavartikam, chapter 3, verse 68. This is Pararthanumanu. It is well established that two means of knowledge are available for our knowledge of other minds. Two pramanas. The existence of the feeling of others is proved in the utterance of words, in vyahara, the word, in vowels of sentences. I sent sentences like K.C. Pandey just now used, I am very afraid. I am feeling fear. That's one. So we know from Shabda Praman and from their actions, how he behaved or how they behave. Basically, the claim is that um, just as the external world realist infers conscious awareness in others by noticing voluntary actions, kriya, in one's own body, buddhi purvam kriyam drishtva, preceded by a cognition. Kriya, action, preceded by a cognition. Buddhi purva kriya. The same reasoning could work with the idealist doctrine of consciousness only as well. Here I'll skip a long part of Santanantara Siddhi, establishment of the mind stream of others, because Abhinav Gupta will rehearse this argument and refute it. So I'm keeping the refutation and the argument for later. But to come back, to zoom into the current scene in 21st century, of the debate between theory of mind theory and simulation theory, and how that is kind of mediated by a sort of contemporaneized version of Max Scheller's direct perception of empathy theory of perception of, is an ongoing tussle between two competing theories of our apprehension of the second person's mind. The first theory, continuous with the analogical inference account we have rejected above, is the theory of mind theory. According to this theory, mental states are theoretical posits like electrons and magnetic fields, and equally unobservable. The Sanskrit technical term would be nityanumeya, never to be perceived. They are always to be inferred, which becomes a problem because everybody claims, like early Russell, that we are directly acquainted with others. But to go on, set of causal explanatory conditionals connecting current behavior with future or past or current behavior or mental states. And this is called the folk psychology, the folk theory of mind that all of us have. For example, theory of mind would consist of conditionals like the following. If she's so red in the face, she's going to cry. Or if he came back from the door, he must have forgotten to take his keys. Okay. Or if she got up in the middle of dinner, she must have needed to use the toilet. Hundreds and thousands of such conditional interpretation rules constitutes the child's pre-theoretical, rough and ready theory of mind. One major rift within the theory of mind camp is between empiricists such as Churchland, who claim that a folk psychology is entirely learned, confirmed, and corrected like an ongoing ragbag scientific theory by the child from its human environment, which seems eventually to beg the question, since experience never yields any of those inference rules, since the other's mental or neurocerebral property to be inferred is inaccessible to experience. That's my criticism. And there are others within the theory camp who are innatists, such as Caruthers, who argue that unless the child is born with a core theory of mind, it would not pick up more such law-like connections by observing and interacting with its similar ones. Hence, theory, a very strong candidate is simulation theory. Nivedita or K.C. Pandey, whoever, am I audible up till now?
You're audible, Professor.
And is the, is what I'm saying still intelligible in the general sense? Am I reading too fast?
No, it's okay, sir.
Thank you. Against theory, a very strong candidate is a simulation theory. Simulation theory claims to be a hot against a cold theory of mind reading. It makes mind reading not a propositional intellectual job, but a more touchy-feely and participatory act of immersing oneself in a make-believe role-playing in order to come up with a warmer, empathic mind reading. The core idea is enshrined in the popular idiom of oneself getting into someone else's shoes in order to figure out how she feels. And this can often be done by imitating, as it were, imitating the situation and participating in it. If A notices B in a certain condition and understands that B is nervous, anxious, or embarrassed, the steps of simulation, imitation, are supposed to be 1. A observes B in what appears to be uncomfortable position with certain bodily changes. B, number 2, A imagines himself in B's bodily contextual position and imagines having such overt changes. A simulates, pretends, impersonates that he is B. Like suppose somebody's father has passed away, and you go in the morning in the family or the house of the bereaved person, and you imagine automatically, not by explicitly saying, I shall now imagine, but you imagine what it would be like if your father passed away, or what it was like when your father passed away, whatever. Next step, in the role of B, in the pretend role of B, A undergoes some feelings, experiences, beliefs, desires, etc., as if they are A's own. And then, like we've been saying here in the online remote meetings, then A goes offline, delinking these mental states from his own ego involvement. Okay. As it were, like Emily Dickinson, A says, I am nobody. But there is this mental state without an ego. ownerless. The outputs of this simulation process, finally, are then taken and tagged on, ascribed to B. Thus, A knows or has some justification to believe that B is feeling afraid, anxious, embarrassed, etc. Ignoring the big and small internal differences within this camp, what is the most vital distinction between these two accounts of mind reading? Let's focus on that. It seems that they have split between themselves the two insights that originally prompted the analogical inference view. That view was rooted in the idea that we need to figure out or use some general premise to infer the current mental states of another. And that in the process, our sense of possibly being in a similar position, similarity, analogy, has some role to play. Now, theory seems to have taken the inferential figuring out part very seriously, but ignored the analogical what if I were you part. Thus, there is no need to look within and feel the emotions that one is going to ascribe to the other for a folk psychologist who is completely uninvolvedly, almost like a behaviorist, giving a theoretical explanation of why the other is running away or why the other is shedding tears in the form she would not have cried if she was not upset. She would not have run away unless she was afraid. The mind reader of the theory does not need to introspect or play at introspecting in this account. But simulation theory, my being similar to you, my pretending I am in your position is absolutely crucial. Let's see what I would have felt had I been in a similar position in a spontaneous mimicking way. To the extent I can make you myself in this make-believe reenactment, the rest of the inner story is supposed to follow. At the turn of the 21st century, the most popular view among cognitive scientists and philosophers of mind was a bunch of the two views. This is known as interaction theory, inspired by the work on empathy, originally done by Max Scheler, Edith Stein, and the work done by Simon Baron Cohen on autism by Sean Gallagher and Evan Thompson, and they have all come up with this integration of the best elements of both TT theory and ST simulation theory, incorporating evidence of the neonatal imitation of others, interpreted, although controversially, by Andrew Meltzoff and Peter Marshall in their 2014 and again 2019 papers. The discovery or alleged discovery of mirror neurons in the human brain is supposed to have boosted or added support to this kind of an overall empathic theory of knowing of all of other minds. I want to, at this point, share my screen and show you guys original evidence of a Meltzoff's early 90s paper. Let me see if I can do that. I hope sharing screen is allowed. Is my screen visible?
Visible, Professor.
Human infants, this is to use their abstract, are prolific imitators. And look at how the original pictures from actually 1980s. This experiment was done on the baby is 1 week old. They actually start doing it earlier, and it's not a particularly gifted baby. So when the adult sticks out his tongue, with a little bit of fidgeting, the baby does, you can see what it is doing. Then the adult opens up his mouth like a yawn, the baby does that. When the adult puckers his face and screws up his mouth, the baby tries to do that. Okay. From this, it was inferred. Recent results show that the infant mu rhythm in the brain, which is detected by an electroencephalograph, okay, is desynchronized during action execution as well as action observation. Current work is elucidating properties of the infant mu rhythm and how it may relate to pre-linguistic action processing and social understanding. The baby, by doing that, figures out what is being done. It's like those of us who, get deeply into classical music, whether we can or not, in our head, and sometimes in undertones, we try to imitate a particular tone that the singer is doing, and thereby understand what she's doing. Here we consider this neuroscience research in relation to developmental psychological theory, particularly, and look at this word, like me framework, which holds that one of the chief cognitive tasks of the human infant is to map the similarity between the self and the other. We elucidate the value of integrating neuroscience findings with behavioral studies of infant imitation and the reciprocal benefit of examining mirroring mechanisms from an ontogenetic perspective. Okay, I want to stop sharing now. Of course, there has been a backlash against such interpretation of neonatal imitation, and cognitive scientists have protested that the evidence for mirror neurons is at best tenuous and at worst has nothing to do with adult humans' social cognition of others' feelings. Okay, so the total theory would be that our natural process of mind reading consists of all the following 6 operations: innate facial and muscular mimicry and emotional contagion, eye direction detection, shared attention mechanism, joint attention mechanism, face reading cues, as in theory deployment, and simulation, that is imaginative role playing or role reversal. Perhaps we should propose a newly recognized but perennially used knowledge source, pramana, empathy, which is a mixture of all 6 of these. Okay. Let me now switch back. In spite of, to Abhinavagupta, in spite of the emergence of such a synthetic view, the basic conceptual issue, which I call the trouble of the I with the you, still remains unresolved. How can I directly and subjectively experience your pain and anger or desire without making it my pain, anger, or desire? This is where I would like to derive new insights from the 11th century Indian phenomenologist of emotions and consciousness, Abhinavagupta, the Kashmir Shaiva philosopher. Abhinavagupta first reconstructs Dharmakirti's version of the analogical inference for the existence of other minds. This is what I promised. It would be said that in myself I observe voluntary actions such as utterance of words, vyaharanam, uttering of words, invariably pervaded vyapti by a wish of the samiha of the form, let me speak. That is, before I speak, I always find a desire to speak in me. By self-awareness, I have established the connection between my will and my action. From others, like Chaitra's action, another person, I can now infer back a will outside the stream of my consciousness because his speech, which I am hearing, is not preceded by my desire to speak, and yet it cannot be uncaused. And since speeches like that are always caused by desire of some kind, and it is not my desire, therefore it follows by the argument from residue that it must be their desire, like a parishesha anuman. Therefore, the existence of another stream of consciousness is easily established. Couldn't we say that? When he goes on, it goes a fatal logical error in it. And here I'm translating from Ishvara Pratyabhijna Vimarshi. Here, one who infers this other's mental state has two types of experience of utterance of words. At the time of establishing the rule of universal concomitance, Vyapti, the drawer of the inference, correlates the experience of phenomenon describable as I am now uttering words. When I hear my words, I can also feel in my vocal cords how the words, how it feels. So it is a first person experience of uttering words, even if the auditory experience is like hearing somebody else, but it is never like hearing somebody else. With the subjective experience, it is correlated. I have a desire to communicate preceding these utterances, which is unsevered from one's own self-awareness, subjectivity. But in applying the rule of Vyakti to the case of the other body, he at best has the experience or the sense data that other body is emitting words. That's an auditory experience of an external world phenomenon. Now, this new phenomenon, that body is making some noises, severed from the subjectivity of the one who draws the inference, is quite distinct from the hetu or the sign, prover's sign, which has been established as concomitant with an inner desire, since the sign was my utterance of words. The first person cause, my inner desire, could explain the occurrence of the first person effect, my utterance. How can it explain the distinct type of third person effect, his utterance? But if I know that what I have to infer from your utterance is not my inner desire, but your desire to speak, then I must have already formed the concept of you as another person capable of having desires, and the whole inference to the existence of another stream of consciousness is rendered redundant. If anybody wants to check, this is to be found under Jnanadhikara, fifth Annika, verses 4 and 5. So Abhinavagupta is threatening the classical analogical inference with a dangerous destructive dilemma. Either the sign, hetu, or premise of the inference, uttering of words by another body, is inconclusive, anaikantika, because it has no pre-established general connection with the inner states of wish, etc. Being based in one's own case, the inductively generalizable sign would have to be uttering of words by me connected to my wish to mean something. The alleged inferential sign, emission of word sounds by that other body, is entirely unlike the felt first person phenomenon of my uttering the words. So the inference fails. Or alternatively, one has already learned to treat he utters words as a special case of I utter words, said with an I, which is a mere place marker for general subjects, any speaker, any karta, or vakta, speaker, in which case one has already established the existence of a first person, a self in the other body, and one does not need this kind of analogical inference. So the so-called proof of other minds is either inconclusive or circular. Iha anumatu vyapti grahana kale vyaptereva siddhe anyonyashrayatva. Now, the most crucial section, Wittgenstein's reductio ad absurdum argument against the analogical inference, and Abhinavagupta's welcoming the alleged absurd consequence, Ishtapati. Wittgenstein also attacked the analogical argument, which privileges the first person feelings and then gets stuck trying to ascribe the same feelings to others on the basis of behavioral cues in an unpublished numbered manuscripts, sometimes called the big manuscript. It has not yet been published. Wittgenstein wrote, "Why do I call toothache my toothache? When I say of someone else, he has toothache, I mean with toothache, as it were, a part of what I normally call my toothache." The question is, can I ever take the my part out of my concept of toothache? I cannot. Because the only toothache I know is my toothache. In philosophical remarks, philosophisch Bemerkungen, Wittgenstein comes up with a reductio ad absurdum or prasanga argument against the analogical inference theory. If I have an inductive generalization that whenever someone is screaming ouch and putting their hand on their cheek, they must be feeling what I feel when I do that, which is my toothache. If that is the argument, then the analogical argument will warrant the absurd conclusion that if Professor Rastogi is screaming ouch and touching his cheek with his hand, then Professor Rastogi must be feeling my toothache, because that's the sadhya property with which my making that bodily gesture has been connected by invariable concomitance of vyapti. Very simply, I know what it means that I have toothache, and when I say that he has toothache, and this is Wittgenstein, I'm quoting him again from the manuscript. Very simply, I know what it means that I have toothache, and when I say that he has toothache, then I mean that now he has what I had then. In a manuscript from 1932, this is expressed very clearly. Instead of saying the other is in pain, we say his tooth does ouch. But you don't want to deny that the other can have what you have. Surely not. If I have gray hair, the other person can have gray hair. If I have a bad tooth, then the other person can have bad tooth. Also in the case of bad teeth. But when I apply this concept in case of pain, it will never come from my personal subjective pain to his pain, but always from my pain in my tooth to my pain in his tooth. But can I have my pain in his tooth? That's the best case scenario for the analogical argument. What is most surprising in Abhinavagupta's style of argumentation here is that while he would go along with Wittgenstein's criticism that as an inference, the analogical argument from my own case is worthless. Peter Strawson called it an inductive generalization from a single case, namely my own case. He would, Abhinavagupta, would challengingly ask at the end, what is so absurd if I ascribe my pain to others? In the sense that for a feeling of pain or any other emotion or even cognitive state to be Subjective is to be felt as what it is like for me to feel it. So when I see and say that Rakesh Chandra is angry, or Rup is ashamed of Indian males' condonement of rampant raping of Dalit women, I'm ascribing anger to Rakesh and shame to Rup. Then I am ascribing my anger and my shame to them. Why not? This dialectical move, called Ishtapatti, welcoming the absurd result, in Indian logic of debate is affordable by Abhinava Gupta because of his ultimate embrace of a single center of all our subjectivities. This is not an avenue available to late Wittgenstein, though in the Tractatus he did say the unsayable. This world is my world. Even in the Blue Book, when he talks about this problem of ascribing mental states to others, he toys with the possibility of somebody feeling pain, acute pain, maybe in a battlefield where there are dead bodies strewn all over, but she's feeling his pain in a fellow soldier's hand, not in his own hand. Non-Western post-Cartesian thought not only finds the problem of other mind hard to solve, it also ends up finding the very presence of the other as existentially threatening as hell. You know, a la Jean-Paul Sartre's play called No Exit, where there is a dialogue, the other is hell. Abhinav Gupta, on the other hand, finds the you to be a foundational middle reality between the pure self and the external world, in contrast and community with which the self discovers its own playful knowerhood. He insists that even if we try to look upon the other person's body as a mere physical object, the moment that inert body over there is addressed in communication, even when we say such dramatic things as, listen, you stones, Shrinuta Gravana, listen, mountains, it is completely enveloped with the I feeling of the addresser. Every speaker subject is ultimately the I, which is a secret name of Paramashiva. The this, idam, which is called Nara in Tantra, the mundane object man, the third person, he or she, or they, as nowadays kids say. That is Nara. And then when the Nara is addressed as a you, it becomes a I, this, ahamidam, and that's called Shakti, the feminine power. This tantric principle of deriving the second person through making an I out of the this is beautifully reflected in the transformations of the German verb to be. The ist, das ist of the third person, when immersed in the ich bin of the first person, joining the ist and the bin, it becomes bist. Du bist, taking out the contrasting M from asmi and the contrasting ta from asti, the second person Shakti only retains what is common between Shiva and Nara, which is asi, tvam asi, idam asti, aham asmi. There's a contrast. Together, tvam asi. The principle of addressing demands, when I say, hey, you standing there, I mean that Just as I stand and I feel, my cognition, will, action manifest itself as standing. You are standing too, thus assimilating your thisness into my I-ness, and together creating an uninterrupted relishing of subjectivity. The sense in which, and this is a quotation from Paratrinshika Vivaranam, the sense in which the addresser and the addressee, though different, become one in the addressing activity is indicative of para goddess, whose characteristic is identity indifference. And I say, and I feel, my dear friend, you indeed am I, through linguistic acts such as addressing and speaking of oneself as another, such as in look at me, this is myself. By the way, there's a beautiful book that analytic philosophers should read because it has a lot of analytic philosophy by Paul Ricoeur, who's supposed to be a continental philosopher, phenomenologist. And the book is called Oneself as Another. Through a chain of subtle reasoning, Abhinavagupta shows that when one suffers from, let us say, guilt or repentance, look at me, this is myself, fie on me, take mom. We, as it were, turn the I into a you, into a that. So both are done. But here is Abhidhamma gives a very subtle argument to overcome even the basic otherness between myself and you. First, let it be admitted that my own consciousness is known to me directly. I know what it is like to be self-aware and aware of outer objects from in here, from my perspective. And if, say, in the context of effort at empathy with a friend, I feel acutely that I am not feeling this friend's own emotions, the beginning of sensitivity is not perfect empathy, is feeling that why am I not being able to feel, even in an embrace with another person, even in a warm handshake, what is beyond the frontiers of the skin? As a missed feeling, don't I have to subjectively be aware of those emotions in however inadequate a fashion? Don't I have to know what is it that I'm failing to feel? In that sense, couldn't the unfelt pleasures and pains of another person become objects of my first imaginative and then direct awareness as what I fail to feel, just as a remembered event is experienced by the same experiencer as what is not now happening? Observable actions of sentient beings are quite distinct from mere physical movements. In the Ishvara Pratyavijna Vivriti Vimarshini, Abhinava comments that even when we are inferring from external movements the internal states of somebody, in that uha, in that abductive inference, otherwise it will be inexplicable kind of inference, the going of the living being is not like the movement of a stone. Neither is the motionless sitting by a person similar to the motionlessness of a stone. So when sitting is used as a P predicate, what Strawson used to call a personal predicate, not as the sitting of a statue, it is different. Everywhere it is undeniable that we notice the actions of others as an action enlivened by the same self-sentient that I feel thus in myself. Thus even others' actions are observed by us to be shimmering, tingling with the same subjectivity as I feel behind my own voluntary actions. This was once in a discussion with Peter Strawson. It came out beautifully. I didn't know Abhinav Gupta then, But Strauss was explaining to me that even when somebody is sitting silently, doing nothing, if they are sitting, that's not like the, the cup is sitting on the table, not like that. And he put it beautifully. He said, because the cup is sitting, the statue is just sitting, but the person has sat down, which is a voluntary action. When we are thus directly aware of the power of activity in others, we see them not as a this body, that body, but as a you. This point is made by Pavlov in many, many, many ways, and in an uncanny way, anticipating all the arguments about robots and zombies. I wouldn't even translate, but Abhinav Gupta says in the long passage under the commentary of Fifth Annika, he says, Tasya asya vyaharami. It is sahitam when the person says, look at me, other person, the other body emits the sound, I am going to speak. So I have to infer that there is a desire to speak which is mental. He says, Prathama Purusha Shabdena Yogyam Paragatatvam Nam Vyahara Visheshasya Asamihitam. So mindless, without any mind, without any desire, Yantra Putrika Vyahara Vilakshanasya. But his speaking is different from the speaking of a Yantra Puttalika, which is a machine which talks, a machine doll, a mechanical doll, which is Abhinav Gupta's translation of a robot. Okay? Yantra Puttika Vyavahara Vilakshanam Yat Visheshanam Tat Chetyajate Tarhi Vyaharana Matrat Samiha Matram Anumiyet. In order to be able to infer that wherever there is speech, there is a desire to speak. The speech has to be distinct from the speaking by a zombie, the speaking by a mindless machine. And this is precisely the words used by Abhinav Gupta. Finally, to summarize the immense capacity of self-consciousness, Vimarsha. I'll translate that. I'll not subject you to the Sanskrit. The free power of self-consciousness, Vimarsha, can do everything. Okay, can do everything. Vimarshastu sarvam sama. It can turn the other into its own self. Param atmi karoti. It can turn the self into an other. Atmanam pari karoti. It can identify the two, and it can leave aside and ignore even this unification of the self and the other. And this self-synthesis is nothing other than inner dialogue, a speech that is not ruled by artificial semantic conventions, but is an uninterruptedly self-relishing use of natural signs like inward noddings, antarmukha shiro nirdesh. The Shaiva non-dualist takes the lesson from this debate between external world realists and idealist Buddhists, the Sautrantikas and the Yogacharas, whose denial of a permanent self in any case is unacceptable to the Shaiva. But the lesson he takes is that the other subject, the other self, can only be established when the other's action is perceived both by him and her in the form I am running, I am speaking, I am spitting, I am dancing. And I cannot resist the temptation here of sharing with you an amazing set of examples that Abhinav Gupta gives here in the discussion of how the subtle eyeing of the other goes on, even in fights and debates. And he says, when two people are fighting on the street, okay, they are they want to make a public display of it. So the word they are shouting at each other, and they are so angry in this example that they are spitting at each other. Okay, they're spitting at each other. So he says, Aham shtivami. Here I am spitting at you. And then he spits. And the other person also says something against. And he gives names to these people. He says, Tathacha. Uh, but then, positive example, if somebody is dancing in joy, he says, Priyatamaya. He's dancing. Three people are dancing together. Chaitra, Maitra, and Chaitra's beloved woman. Priyatamaya, Chaitrena, Cha Maitrena, Cha Saha Nrityati. This is like a Kashmir Shaiva disco going on. Pashyatu iti, bhavati asya abhisandhanam, tat swatmani, vyapti ranena, grihita, rechaka yangahare, with all the dance gestures. Aham nityami, chaitro nityati, chaitro nityatum ichhati, tat swatmani, etatapi katam, tathai swayam anapavarya, without putting a screen, apavaraka, in front of us. Tat nrityati udgrahayati va, tatra tasya abhisandhanamasti, maitropi pashyatu. Let Maitra see that I am dancing. So we perform many of our voluntary actions implicitly for open viewing. Okay, like in a play, some soliloquies are uttered so that people can hear. Okay, and he says, Dishatami, let people see. Yada Pamaraku Daserakum. Pamaraku is one person's name, an ordinary person, a common man. Pamaraku and Daseraku is another one. Anyonyam Shivatu. They are spitting at each other. Okay. Vadino Udgrahayatu. Yuvano Nityata. Tada Ayam Etat Janat. Let him know that this is what I'm doing. So he is speaking. Let them see that I want to spit. I'm doing it because I want to do it. The world my own subjective representations are about would not be an objective world unless it is a shared world. And in order to share the world, I need other equally active conscious I users to share it with. And this is a Wittgensteinian point. My most private mental states would not be objectively, in the Vyavaharika sense, real unless they were intersubjectively available. Because to be objective is to be an object of awareness, independently of whether it is my awareness of others. So absolute solipsistic privacy makes my mental states non-existent. Because to exist, to be real, is to be in principle knowable by others. Abhinav Gupta's own view, if there is any, appears to be the following. The final court of appeal, any philosophical dispute, is the practice of everyday life, forms of life, janasthiti, lokayatra, lokavyavahara. Communication and pragmatic transactions go on really among many conscious active persons, while constructing a transcendental argument from the otherwise inexplicability of this common public practice. We must first note that any attempt to base our knowledge of other people's minds on an logical inference, giving a certain unique priority to a limited first person inner states, will that kind of inference will never take off. Our perception of other active expressive beings spontaneously takes them to be alive. Jivata, Jivanam, they're alive. And to take something else as living is to use a Kantian turn of phrase to recognize their action as capable of being smeared with an I think, and I feel, I intend to do what they are doing, as imitation, intention, as continuous with that soul subjectivity that I am in touch with, of a universal, spatio-temporally indivisible, original unity. Of conclusion. Objectivity, intersubjectivity within a unity of consciousness and public practice. Another Kashmiri philosopher, most probably not a Shaiva, but a Vaishnava, called Vamanadatta, in Samvit Prakasha, comments, the common sense position, this person is other than myself. I am Anya, Aham Anya. I am one, this person is another. And I am distinct from this person. Cannot stay in conflict, even for a moment, against the oneness that we are arguing for. We cannot even assign otherness to the other as long as the other is not self. Beautiful sentence here by Vamanadatta. Okay. Paravyavasthapi parasya. Nakrita. Paravyavastha. Deciding this is para, other, and this is me. Yavat na atmik krita par. Until and unless the para, the other is atmik krita, it cannot be even understood as a para, because to understand is to comprehend, and to comprehend and to apprehend is to subjectivize. This tantric principle of deriving the second person through making an I out of the this I have already talked about. So, if the thought, no one understands what another person wants to say, cannot be put into a public language, it is not even a thought. And that's why, in some moments of anger, sulk, depression, sadness, feeling ununderstood, when we feel that nobody can understand, then we go up to a friend. Remember, in the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein says, beautiful sentence, meaning is like going up to someone. So I go up to a friend and we tell that friend, if you, my friend, do not understand me, but we say that expecting that at least that sentence they are understanding. So, in conclusion, I would like to say, in certain kinds of suffering, I feel so alone in the world that I have to befriend others just to confide in them that I have no friends. This may sound incoherent, at best deliberately paradoxical, but the basic trouble is that I understand you best when I stand next to you in your troubled times and confess to you in all humility that as long as I remain distinct, I fail to understand you fully. I somehow open myself to your wound just when I feel most acutely and painfully that it does not hurt me quite the way it hurts you. Even to feel your separateness from me thus, I need to imaginatively try to fill up the hollow of your foreignness with the kernel of my subjectivity and face you as if I am facing myself, emptying myself from my own limited, exclusive first personness, and to make with Professor Rastogi's permission, a totally imaginative, speculative, different kind of use of a technical term. If I can empty myself from my first personness, then I become a shunya pramada. And thus I can give all my I-ness to you, because that I-ness is not mine, it's not yours. It is I-ness as such, which is called Paramashiva. Thank you very much.
Simply wonderful. This is the word which I can utter at this moment. Mesmerizing talk by Professor Arindam Chakravarti, as we are expected to him to deliver. So I take this opportunity to thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for coming and delivering this wonderful lecture. This has inspired all of us to proceed further in our researches. So now, if it is possible to ask some questions, then we can ask certain questions. Maybe Dr. Inakshi has asked certain question. Otherwise, I would like to invite Professor Naujir Rasuri sir to come and deliver his talk. Professor Naujir Rasuri sir.
Mr. Pandey?
Professor Naujir Rasuri sir, please come.
The question answer session will be later on.
मैं हिंदी में बोलना चाहूँगा। तो प्रोफेसर अरिंदम जी को भी मैं सुन रहा था और अरिंदम को सुनना तो हमेशा एक नया अनुभव होता है। और मैं अच्छा राकेश भी सामने है। मुझे तो सबसे बड़ी बात है कि आज जो आके मुझे आपने बुलाया वो गलत आदमी को बुलाया, इसलिए कि विटगेनस्टाइन के बारे में मुझे कुछ मालूम नहीं है और पाश्चात्य दर्शन के बारे में मैं कुछ ज़्यादा नहीं जानता हूँ। और अरिंदम जी को मैं भी सुन रहा था तो कुछ बहुत अच्छी मैं समझता हूँ कि अभिनव गुप्त को जितना अच्छा अरिंदम समझते हैं शायद इस वक्त विश्व में उनको कोई दूसरा इतना अच्छा नहीं समझता। ये मेरा अपना अनुभव है। और अरिंदम को मैं तो पहचान ही नहीं पाया, ऐसे बिल्कुल साफ है। ये मुझे आज जो अरिंदम जी ने एक बात उठाई और मैं तो अभिनव गुप्त के संदर्भ में थोड़ी सी बात कहना चाहूँगा और फिर अगर समय होगा तो मैं कुछ एक आध बात और कहूँगा। लेकिन सच बात ये है कि दूसरे को समझने की कि दूसरे को तकलीफ हो रही है और ये दूसरे का जो कष्ट है वो हमें कैसे महसूस हो, ये शायद जो समस्या है, ये मैं सोचता हूँ कि ये समस्या दर्शन की भी समस्या है और यही समस्या हमारे कला शास्त्र की भी यही समस्या है, सौंदर्य शास्त्र की भी यही समस्या है और साहित्य की भी यही समस्या है। और मैं समझता हूँ कि अभिनव गुप्त दोनों जगह पर इस प्रश्न को उठाते हैं और अरिंदम जी ने तो बहुत अच्छे ढंग से इसकी बताई है। आप प्रारंभ किया था अरिंदम जी ने बात से कि दूसरे में जो कष्ट होता है तो दूसरा कहता मुझे बड़ी तकलीफ है, तो मुझे कैसे अनुभव हो बड़ी तकलीफ का कहने से होता है। तो हमारे यहाँ टीका बात कही गई कि नहीं, कहने से नहीं होता है, शाब्दिक नहीं है। अगर आप ये कहेंगे कि मुझे बड़ी तकलीफ हो रही है तो मुझे नहीं होगी, लेकिन उसी को जब हम व्यंग्य बना देते हैं तो वो कष्ट जो है वो हमारा हो जाता है। हम जिस समय कोई नाटक देख रहे होते हैं, अभिनव गुप्त ये प्रश्न उठाते हैं और अभिनव गुप्त ये प्रश्न उठाते हैं और कहते हैं कि एक राजा दुष्यंत जो है वो शकुंतला उनको छोड़ के चली गई है, तो राजा दुष्यंत के सामने एक गीत सुन रहे हैं, रानी हंसपदिका एक उनकी पहली रानी थी, तो उनका गीत सुन रहे हैं। और वो गीत सुन करके राजा दुष्यंत कहते हैं कि मेरा मन बड़ा अन्यमनस्क हो गया है, और मैंने तो कभी इस तरह की, मैं तो बड़ा सुखी हूँ, मेरे तो किसी कमी नहीं है, कोई मेरा निजी व्यक्ति कोई बिछड़ा नहीं है, लेकिन मुझे पता नहीं क्यों ये ऐसी तकलीफ क्यों हो रही है कि परिस्थिति भवति मम, मेरा चित्त जो है विचलित हो रहा है। तो कहते हैं ऐसा लगता है कि भावस्थिराणि जन्मांतर सौहृदानि, ये जो भाव है ये शायद दूसरे जन्म से जो सौहृद है हमारा, एक दूसरे के प्रति जो चाह है, वो हमारी दूसरे जन्म से शायद चली आ रही। और ये बात कह करके कालिदास के इस श्लोक को उद्धृत करते हैं, अभिनव को उद्धृत करते हैं, और उद्धृत करने के बाद तब वो वहां उसकी व्याख्या करते हैं। और वहां पर ये बात उठती है कि जिसको हम दूसरा समझ रहे हैं वो क्या दूसरा है वाकई में? तो कहते सच बात तो ये है कि वो दूसरा नहीं है। इनफैक्ट जिसको हम दूसरा कह रहे हैं, निश्चित रूप से सामान्य रूप से सामान्य जीवन में, जैसा अभी अरिंदम जी ने कहा, बहुत बड़ी बढ़िया बात है कि हमें एक सिंगल सब्जेक्टिविटी में हम उसको जब तक सिचुएट नहीं करते तब तक इस प्रकार का संभव नहीं है, अनुभव संभव नहीं है। तो वहां पर वो बात कहते हैं वासना संवाद, अनादि वासना संवाद। वासना शब्द जो है ये जो पूर्व जन्म से हमारी ये चली आ रही है, तो इसीलिए अभी एक प्रश्न और उठाया था, मैं बीच बीच में जो सारी बातें आ रही थी कि एक जो बच्चा नया पैदा होता है वो कैसे रिएक्ट करता है अपनी सिचुएशन के प्रति, दूसरे के प्रति कैसे रिएक्ट करता है, माँ के प्रति कैसे रिएक्ट करता है, बिल्कुल नया है। तो ये सारी जो संभावनाएं हैं, ये सारी बातें तब संभव होती हैं जबकि कहीं न कहीं से हम किसी न किसी रूप में, किसी न किसी स्तर में हमारी अहंता और उसकी अहंता जुड़ गई। तो यहाँ पर दो बातें, एक तो आपको उत्तर मिलता है काव्य शास्त्र से, और काव्य शास्त्र में वो कहते हैं कि हम दूसरे के अनुभव को अपना अनुभव बना लेते हैं व्यंजना के द्वारा, और व्यंजना ये काम करती है कि वहां पर बात उठती है, तो वह इसीलिए कहते हैं कि वो जितने भी आप वहां क्या देख रहे हैं, दुष्यंत की रति देख रहे हैं, दुष्यंत की पीड़ा देख रहे हैं, दुष्यंत की उदासी देख रहे हैं, और वो आप जो उदासी बन जाती है जब दर्शक वहां से हटता है कहते ऑडिटोरियम से, तो वो या तो बहुत खुश होकर लौटता है या बहुत दुखी होकर लौटता है, और वहां के जो नायक और नायिका हैं या जो पात्र हैं उनका जो अनुभव है उस अनुभव को लेकर के वो हटता है वहां से, और वो अनुभव जो है वो दुष्यंत का अनुभव नहीं होता है, वो उस पाठक, उस दृष्टा का, उस श्रोता का, उस हृदय का, उस सामाजिक का अनुभव होता है। तो ये कहाँ से बात आती है? ये बात आती है जबकि आप कैसे अपनी अहंता को, आप अपनी सब्जेक्टिविटी और उसके अहम को कैसे एक बनाते हैं। आप कहते हैं कि वहां पर जो देश काल और आपकी जो पर्सनलाइजिंग एडजंक्ट्स हैं, जो उपाधियां हैं, उनको आप हटा करके तो उसके लिए एक शब्द का इस्तेमाल करते हैं साधारणीकरण, साधारणीभाव। आप सिर्फ साधारण हो जाते हैं, एक व्यक्ति के रूप में, एक अहम के रूप में आप रहते हैं, और उसको उसी अहम से, वहां उस दुष्यंत की वेदना नहीं है, वो शकुंतला की वेदना है। आप कभी सोचिएगा कि एक पुरुष शकुंतला की वेदना को उसी तरीके से ग्रहण करता है जिस तरीके से दुष्यंत की, एक स्त्री दुष्यंत के अनुभव को उसी तरह से ग्रहण करती है। तो क्यों? क्योंकि हम मनुष्य के रूप में, एक व्यक्ति के रूप में हम उसको ग्रहण करते हैं। तो एक बात तो हमें वहां पर दिखाई देती है। दूसरी जो तर्क अभी अरिंदम जी ने दिया, बहुत महत्वपूर्ण तर्क है। अरिंदम जी ने एक पेपर लिखा था, मैं समझता हूँ शायद 2005 में लिखा था, इसी बहुत तत्र ज्ञानम स्वतः सिद्धम क्रिया कायाश्रिता सती, ये उत्पल देव की एक कारिका है जिसको आपने उद्धृत किया था कि तत्व ज्ञानम सतः सिद्धम क्रिया कायाश्रिता सती कि परैरप्य लक्ष्य त्या अन्य ज्ञान मूल्य। आपको इस पर बहुत अच्छी चर्चा की, मुझे उसको विशेष रूप से नहीं कहना है, और उसको विशेष रूप से योगाचार सूत्रांतकों के आर्गुमेंट के साथ किस प्रकार से हमें दूसरे के अनुभव तक हम पहुंचते हैं, इस बात को उत्पल देव उठाते हैं। और उस पर अरिंदम जी का बहुत ही बढ़िया लेख है। मैं थोड़ा सा उसका शीर्षक बोल रहा हूँ, अरिंदम जी आपको याद है वो तो यानी मैं ये कहना चाहूंगा कि मुझे इस कारिका का अर्थ उनका लेख पढ़ने के बाद समझ में आया। तो ये लेकिन तो ये जो चीजें कहते हैं कि आप क्या देखते हैं, आप दूसरे का शब्द सुनते हैं, आप बोल रहे हैं, जब आप बोल रहे हैं तो आपके मन में निश्चित, जब आप बोल रहे हैं तो आपके मन में दुख है, सुख है, पीड़ा है, आप कुछ कहना चाहते हैं, तो बिना उसके पीछे इच्छा है। तो हम कैसे जानते हैं कि देखिए वो इच्छा आपकी है, बोल आप रहे हैं, वो इच्छा आपकी है, वो मेरी इच्छा नहीं है। लेकिन हम ये कैसे जान रहे हैं कि आपके मन में ये इच्छा थी या आपके मन में ये कष्ट था जिसको आप इस वाक्य से, आपसे अगर किसी ने आपसे कहा जाए, आप व्यंग से कहना चाहते हैं आप चले जाएं, सर मैं क्यों जाऊं? अब ये जो मेरा उत्तर है कि मैं क्यों जाऊं, निश्चित रूप से कि मैं मना करना चाहता हूं, मुझे नहीं जानना। अब ये जो रिएक्शन मेरा निगेटिव रिएक्शन है, क्योंकि मेरे शब्द निगेटिव नहीं है, लेकिन मेरे मन में तो भावना भी निगेटिव है, और वो आपके मन में जा रही है। क्यों जा रही है? तो कहते हैं कि जैसे हम बोलते हैं, जब हमारे बोलने के पूर्व एक इच्छा होती है, हम ये देखते हैं जब हम कोई बात कहना चाहते हो तो ठीक उसी तरीके से हम ये कहते हैं कि उसके मन में इच्छा हुई। अब जब ये इच्छा हुई होगी तो बहुत महत्वपूर्ण आर्गुमेंट है, और मैं सोचता हूँ कि अरिंदम जी ने, चूंकि ये ऑलरेडी इसको बड़ी विस्तार से बात कही, मुझे वो नहीं कहना है, लेकिन सबसे बड़ी चीज ये है कि जब उसकी इच्छा है, वो बोल रहा है, तो व्याप्ति जो बन रही है, जब आप अनुमान कर रहे हैं, आप ध्यान दीजिएगा, तो अनुमान आप कर रहे हैं, तो उसके बोलने से उसकी का अनुमान होगा। तो मुझे तो वो अनुमान, वो व्याप्ति तो मुझ तक पहुंची ही नहीं, मैं कैसे उसका अनुमान करूंगा? और मैंने जो व्याप्ति बनाई वो अपने बारे में बनाई, तो उसका कॉमन आधार क्या होगा? तो जब तक हम आपकी अन्यता या परता जो है उसको हम अपनी अस्मिता में सिचुएट नहीं करते, तब तक वो अनुमान भी नहीं बन सकता। तो इस प्रकार से जो अहम बोध है, वो अहम बोध जो है, वो आप समझिए उस अहम बोध की परिधि में जो हम आप तुम सब हैं, सब आ जाते हैं। ये तो फिर बहुत अच्छा विषय है, कभी अरिंदम जी को अलग से सुनिए, इस विषय के ऊपर बहुत अच्छा है, लेकिन या कभी चर्चा होगी। मैं आप सबसे छोटा सा एक और, आपने एक दृष्टांत और देना चाहता हूँ, छोटा सा दृष्टांत। भाषा, लैंग्वेज। अभी मैं कहता हूं, बहुत साधारण सा दृष्टांत है, मैं कहता हूं तुम जाओ, तुम्हारा काम हो गया, तुम जाओ। आपके मन में अर्थ क्या निकलता है? आपके मन में देखिए शब्द क्या है, तुम, क्रियापद क्या है, जाओ। तो अर्थ तो, अगर लिटरल मीनिंग होगा तो अर्थ तो यही होगा कि तुम, सेकंड पर्सन, जाओ, कमांड, ऑर्डर। लेकिन अर्थ ये नहीं होता। आपके मन में अर्थ होता है कि तो अब मैं जाऊं, अब मैं जाऊं, तो मुझसे कहा गया तो मैं जाऊं। अब आप मान कीजिएगा कि हमने तो कहा है कि तुम जाओ, और ये परिवर्तित कैसे हो जाता है आप में जाकर के कि मैं जाऊं, मुझे जाना चाहिए। अब ये जो तुम का अहम में परिवर्तन है, तो अभिनव तो इसके लिए एक दूसरे शब्द का आविष्कार करते हैं, वो कहते हैं शब्दन, शब्दन व्यापार है। ये कभी और चर्चा की बात होगी। यानी क्या हो रहा है कि शब्द में भी यहां पर जो एक चीज है, अब कि जो हम आपसे कह रहे हैं बिंब के रूप से हमारा शब्द है तुम जाओ, ये बिंब है। आपके मन में जो भाषिक आर्थिक प्रतिबिंब पड़ रहा है, जो रिफ्लेक्सिव मीनिंग आपके मन में है, वो ये है कि मैं जाऊं। तो ये जो प्रतिबिंब पड़ा, उस प्रतिबिंब में तुम जो है वो अहम में कन्वर्ट हो गया। तो यदि हर चीज जाकर के अहम में विश्रांत नहीं होती तो अर्थ लगता ही नहीं है, आपके रिएक्शंस बनते ही नहीं, आपके किसी प्रकार का मानसिक संवेगात्मक किसी प्रकार का व्यवहार संभव ही नहीं। और इसलिए जो पारस्परिक विनिमय है, जिसको हम संसार कहते हैं, संसार का अर्थ ये है कि जो हमारे आपके बीच में, कहना चाहिए कि हमारे आपके बीच में जो परस्पर व्यापार का हेतु है। आप देखिएगा, हम भाषा में करते क्या है? हम भाषा में शब्दों का आदान प्रदान करते हैं या दो विमर्शों का आदान प्रदान करते हैं। जब हम कहते हैं कि तुम जाओ, या हम कोई कविता पढ़ते कुछ भी, तो वहां पर आप जो हम कहा जा रहा है, वहां पर जो हमारा विमर्श है, जो हमारी मानसिक अवधारणा, हमारा वक्तव्य विषय, वो आप में ट्रांसमिट हो रहा है। शब्द ट्रांसमिट, शब्द तो केवल व्हीकल है, इसलिए शब्द आप वहां दूसरे लगा सकते हैं। हम कहते तुम जाओ, हम कह सकते यू गो, शब्द तो बना दिए हमने, लेकिन मीनिंग वही रहा। तो ये जो एक चीज है कि इसीलिए आकर के आप देखिएगा हमारा व्यवहार, हमारी भाषा, हमारी संवेदनाएं, हमारे संवेग, हमारे भाव, ये तभी संभव। तो हमें जो ज्ञान होता है वो हम कभी निश्चित रूप से, हम सामान्य रूप से नहीं जानते, लेकिन जब विवेचना करते हैं तो हम ये देखते हैं कि आ करके हमारे अहम में ही आ करके जब तक चीज विश्रांत नहीं होती। इसके लिए तो अभी कुछ दिन पूर्व अरिंदम जी का ही भाषण सुन रहा था, तो जो हमारे तांत्रिक अभी परा 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 और अपरा तीनों स्थितियों की बात की, शिव शक्ति और हम मनुष्य, इन तीनों की बात करते हैं। तो इन सारी चीजों में एक बात लगातार उस तांत्रिक डिस्कोर्स के साथ साथ एक हमारे मानवीय व्यवहार, और मानवीय व्यवहार के साथ साथ उसका एक दार्शनिक, उसकी मीमांसा, वो तीनों चीजें उसके साथ चल रही है। सबसे बड़ी बात यह है कि कश्मीर शिव दर्शन के बारे में और अभिनव बुद्ध के बारे में जो सबसे बड़ी महत्वपूर्ण बात है कि जो अरिंदम जी ने कही, और वो एक बात वो कहते हैं, अभिनव बुद्ध विमर्शनी में कहते हैं, वो कहते हैं कि जिस वो घोर अद्वैतवादी मोनिज्म को लेकर चलते हैं, और जब हम मोनिज्म की बात करते हैं तो इसके माने क्या है, इसका अर्थ क्या हुआ कि सीधी सी बात है कि जिस जहां से हम उठ रहे हैं कि हम पर के मन को कैसे जानते हैं, तो मोनिज्म के कहने का अर्थ है कि हम पर को मानते ही नहीं। अब पर के दो तरीके हो सकते हैं कि या तो हम पर का निषेध कर दें और या हम पर को अपने में मिला लें। तो कश्मीर शिव दर्शन में अभिनव पर को अपने में मिला लेते हैं, पर का हम निषेध नहीं करते, पर हमारे लिए है ही नहीं, हम ही पर। तो ये इस दृष्टि से हम देखते हैं तो मैं समझता हूँ कि भाषा के स्तर पर, विषय के स्तर पर, यानी हर जगह पर ये लगातार तो अभी अरिंदम जी ने वामनदत्त का नाम लिया, बहुत अच्छी, कोई खास बात नहीं है, लेकिन मुझे लगा कि बहुत अच्छी। एक्चुअली कश्मीर की चीज खास और भी है। कश्मीर में ये बात तो सही है कि हम कश्मीर शिव दर्शन का नाम लेते हैं, लेकिन कश्मीर शिव दर्शन की जो एक वैचारिक जो पृष्ठभूमि रही है, वो एक जो वातावरण है, जैसे वामन दत्त जो है, जैसे जिनका अभी नाम लिया आपने संबित प्रकाश, तो वामन दत्त वैष्णव आचार्य है, वो शैव नहीं है। लेकिन यदि आप संबित प्रकाश को पढ़ेंगे तो आपको ये लगेगा नहीं केवल कि नाम मात्र विष्णु को हटा के शिव कर दीजिए, तो आपको लगेगा ही नहीं कि आप शिव ग्रंथ नहीं पढ़ रहे हैं। इसलिए योग वाशिष्ठ नहीं, ये मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि पूरी की पूरी शायद जो वो वातावरण, जिस वातावरण में डेवलप होती है, अभिनव गुप्त तो उत्पन्न आदि का काम अपने आप में ये था, वो बहुत महत्वपूर्ण काम था। वो काम ये था कि उन्होंने उसको शास्त्रीय आधार दिया, एक उन्होंने उसको तर्कण पद्धति दी। सोमानंद से लेकर के अभिनव गुप्त को पूरी परंपरा को जगत कहते हैं कि तर्क से व्याख्याकारश्च, ये लॉजिशियन सिस्टम, ये सिस्टम को एक एपिस्टेमोलॉजी दे रहे हैं, एक आधार प्रदान कर रहे हैं, मीमांसा दे रहे हैं। तो ये काम उन्होंने किया शास्त्रबद्ध रूप से, वो बड़ी गजब ढंग से किया है। और मैं समझता हूँ कि आपके माध्यम से कि ये भारत की बड़ी समृद्ध परंपरा है और ये देश का दुर्भाग्य रहा है। शायद मैं 5 मिनट और ले लेता हूँ, उसके बाद फिर शायद आपको मालूम, अभी आप लोगों ने अभिनव का नाम तो बहुत सुना है और हम ये मान के चलते हैं, मेरा ये कहना है कि अभिनव गुप्त की ये 21वीं शताब्दी जो भारतीय दर्शन का जहाँ तक संबंध है, वो अभिनव गुप्त की शताब्दी है। और उसका कारण है क्योंकि हम बौद्धों के बारे में, नैयायिकों के बारे में, सारे के बारे में जान चुके। हमने अभी यदि कोई अपने ज्ञान का जो पन्ना जो नहीं खोला है, बिल्कुल पूरा पढ़ा हुआ है, वो अभिनव गुप्त का पन्ना है। और इस विश्वविद्यालय का एक विशेष योगदान भी रहा है काशी के दर्शन कि यही मैं ये मानता हूँ काशी शैव दर्शन के एक तरीके से देखा जाए तो त्रिक दर्शन के 3 मुख्य केंद्र देश में रहे। एक काशी या वाराणसी, कश्मीर, कश्मीर में लखनऊ, काशी में पंडित गोपीनाथ खबरानी जी, और लखनऊ में आपके अध्यक्ष जी जो केसी पांडे जी हैं, इन्हीं के नाम वाले थे वो हमारे गुरु जी, तो कांचन पांडे जी, जिनका अभिनव इंस्टीट्यूट था। और विश्व में 1935 में जो उनका ग्रंथ आया, उनका श्रेय ये है कि काश्मीर शैव दर्शन को एक शास्त्र के रूप में उन्होंने प्रस्तुत किया। ये एक उनका योगदान था। आपको शायद ये ताज्जुब हो या न हो कि अभिनव गुप्त के बारे में हमारी जानकारी बड़ी नई इस अर्थ में है कि आप ये समझिए कि 19वीं शताब्दी के अंत तक हम लोग अभिनव का नाम नहीं जानते थे। दार्शनिक के अभिनव को बहुत जानते, कला के विद्यार्थी और रस के विद्यार्थी, अलंकार शास्त्र के विद्यार्थी, ध्वनि शास्त्र के विद्यार्थी, ये अभिनव का खूब नाम जानते हैं। अभिनव के बिना अलंकार शास्त्र, काव्य शास्त्र, साहित्य शास्त्र, लेकिन अभिनव गुप्त उतने ही बड़े दार्शनिक भी हैं। इस बात की चेतना जो है वो हमारी बहुत नई है। यानी आप समझिए कि हम अभिनव के बारे में 1870 थोड़ा जानना शुरू करते हैं जब अभिनव की मैन्युस्क्रिप्ट आती है। और एक बात और, आपको शायद फिर एक आश्चर्य की बात है कि अभिनव गुप्त के वर्तमान काल में जो सबसे पहले वो मुंशी नवल किशोर के पृष्ठ से 1876 में, आपको भी भेज दूंगा, ये पहली पुस्तक थी ये अभिनव का। लेकिन उसके बाद भी नहीं जानते थे अभिनव के बारे में। जानना तो आप समझिए कि 1908 में वार्णिक आते हैं, वार्णिक परमार्थ का अनुवाद करते हैं, और उसके बाद 1911 से जो काश्मीर सीरीज प्रकाशित होती है, काश्मीर सीरीज कश्मीर, उसके बाद से थोड़ा हमारा परिचय शुरू होता है। और जैसी चटर्जी अपनी किताब लिखते हैं 1913 में काश्मीर शैविंग के नाम से, तब हमारा थोड़ा सा परिचय काश्मीर शैविंग से शुरू होता है। लेकिन उसके पहले जानते ही नहीं थे। तो इस तरह देखा जाए फिर महत्वपूर्ण काम पांडे जी से होता है, उधर लक्ष्मण जी और लक्ष्मण जी के जो शिष्यों की परंपरा है उससे, ये जो कुछ लोग हुए उधर गोपीनाथ गजराज जी और इन लोगों ने मिल करके, तो काश्मीर शेड्यूल के बारे में हमारा परिचय तो बहुत थोड़ा है, बड़ा नया है, थोड़ा तो मैंने बड़ा नया है। लेकिन इससे आप जानते हैं भारतीय दर्शन को नुकसान, केवल आप 16वीं शताब्दी में काश्मीर शैव दर्शन के बारे में यानी सोचिए पूरे इतिहास में अभिनव गुप्त और उत्पल की आज करीब 1100 वर्ष हो गए उनको। इसी साल हम लोगों ने अभिनव गुप्त का एक मिलेनियम सेलिब्रेशन किया था। तो ये पहली दशाब्दी है अभिनव गुप्त की, मिलेनियम की, इस सहस्राब्दी के ये पहला दशक है जिसमें कि अभिनव गुप्त। अब इसमें ये कि अभिनव गुप्त इस दशक में आने के नाते अभिनव के बारे में देश भर में प्रचार तो बहुत हुआ है, लेकिन अभिनव गुप्त के कामों के बारे में जिस गंभीरता से अरिंदम जी विचार करते हैं, जिस गंभीरता से उसे विचार किया जाना चाहिए, वो चीज हमारे सामने अभी नहीं आ पा रही है। तो मैं ये जरूर सोचता हूँ कि अभिनव के साथ हुआ क्या है कि जैसे मैंने अभी आपसे कहा कि 16वीं शताब्दी में एक व्यक्ति नाम लेता है और वो है माधवाचार्य, जो अपना सर्वदर्शन संग्रह लेते, जो भारतीय दर्शन के विद्यार्थी होंगे वो जानते होंगे। उन्होंने प्रतिभिज्ञा दर्शन को अपने सर्वदर्शन संग्रह में रखा, लेकिन बहुत नीचे पर रखा है, उन्होंने बीच में रखा है और उसको न्याय इत्यादि से भी नीचे रखा है। यानी उसमें 8वें नंबर पे दर्शन, 16 दर्शन की गणना करते हैं, उसमें वो 16 या 14 इस तरह दर्शन करते हैं, उसमें 8वां 7वां नंबर प्रतिविद्या दर्शन का है और उसका वेदांत सर्वोच्च। इसके अतिरिक्त पूरे भारतीय दर्शन में कहीं आप सोचिए कि बौद्ध दर्शन जब देश में आया तो उस बौद्ध दर्शन से क्या लाभ हुआ कि बौद्ध दर्शन के पूर्व जो भारतीय दर्शन था वो पूर्व पक्ष बना, और उसके बाद जब बौद्ध दर्शन आया तो बौद्ध दर्शन पूर्व पक्ष बना, और उस पूर्व पक्ष के बनने से भारतीय दर्शन कितना समृद्ध हुआ। और यदि अभिनव गुप्त का दर्शन पूर्व पक्ष बना हुआ होता तो आज भारतीय दर्शन कहाँ पर होता, क्योंकि वो समस्याएं उठते, उन समस्याओं का निदान उठता है। हम अभी एक बहुत महत्वपूर्ण अभिनव के बारे में दूसरी बात मैं कहना चाहता हूँ, जो मैं समझता हूँ कि अभिनव गुप्त जैसा व्यक्ति एक दार्शनिक के रूप में न भूतो न भविष्य। अभिनव गुप्त के बारे में आप ये देखिए कि हमारी यानी मनीषा का कोई पक्ष हो, कोई भी पक्ष, अभिनव गुप्त दार्शनिक थे, अभिनव गुप्त तंत्रविद थे, अभिनव गुप्त योगी थे, अभिनव साधक थे, अभिनव गुप्त अभिनेता थे, अभिनव गुप्त नाट्याचार्य थे, अभिनव गुप्त रस शास्त्री थे, अभिनव गुप्त साहित्य शास्त्री थे, अभिनव गुप्त कवि थे, अभिनव गुप्त स्तोत्रकार थे, अभिनव गुप्त भक्त थे। तो ये एक अभिनव गुप्त भाषाविद थे, अभिनव गुप्त परम वैयाकरण थे। मैं भैया, और सबसे बड़ी बात है कि अभिनव गुप्त हमारे मध्यकालीन भारत के इतिहास के एक कहना चाहिए कि अत्यंत विश्वस्त और प्रामाणिक स्रोत के रूप में उभरते हैं। बौद्ध दर्शन का इतिहास लिखा जाएगा, न्याय दर्शन का इतिहास लिखा जाएगा, सांख्य दर्शन का यदि इतिहास लिखा जाएगा, व्याकरण की परंपराओं की यदि चर्चा की जाएगी, भाषा के सिद्धांतों की यदि चर्चा की जाएगी, कला शास्त्र के जो मर्मज्ञ हैं वो कला की तमाम कहना चाहिए भिन्न शैलियों के उनके इतिहास की चर्चा की जाएगी, तो यदि अभिनव गुप्त को आप हटा दें तो आपके पास बहुत बड़ा सोर्स समाप्त हो जाता है। मेरे आदरणीय मित्र हैं प्रोफेसर मुकुंद, उन्होंने दत्तिलम, एक बहुत बड़े संगीतज्ञ थे, उन्होंने दत्तिलम नाम से ही पुस्तक भी लिखी। दत्तिलम उनका पूर्ण नाम था, दत्तिल नाम था दत्तिला, पुस्तक का नाम है दत्तिलम। तो दत्तिलम जब लिखी तो मुझसे मैंने पूछा, तो कहने साहब दत्तिलम को जब लगाने लगे तो उसका अर्थ ही नहीं लगता था। तो उसको लगाने के लिए आवश्यक ये हुआ कि हमको अभिनव भारती का सहारा लेना, और अभिनव भारती के जो संगीताध्याय है उनको लगा करके तो हमने इसका किया। और स्थिति ये है कि अभिनव भारती के संगीताध्यायों को समझने के लिए हमें दत्तिलम की आवश्यकता पड़ती है। दत्तिलम को समझने के लिए तो अभिनव गुप्त संगीत शास्त्री थे। अभिनव गुप्त जो थे वो उदयन और नाटक की परंपरा के वीणा वादक थे। एक व्यक्ति में इतनी चीजें, और वो भी अपनी पूर्णता की हद तक। जब दर्शन के रूप में बात करते हैं तो अभिनव गुप्त मैं समझता हूँ कि एक परंपरा के शिखर पर बैठ के बात करते हैं। जब वो साहित्य शास्त्र की बात करते हैं तो वो परंपरा के शिखर पर बात करते हैं। कहा जाता है कि बस सिद्धांत के बाद उसके बाद बात कहीं नहीं गई, ध्वनि के ऊपर वो बात आगे बढ़ी नहीं, बढ़नी चाहिए। ये कोई अच्छी बात नहीं कि आगे नहीं बढ़नी चाहिए, लेकिन अभी तक की स्थिति है। तो मैं अब चूंकि आपने मुझे अवसर दिया तो और कोई विशेष बात न करके मैं आपके मन में थोड़ी जिज्ञासा जगाना चाहता था कि इस आपके ही विश्वविद्यालय से चूंकि वो संप्रदाय कुछ आगे बढ़ा है तो आपकी जिज्ञासा होनी चाहिए। और एक ऐसे व्यक्ति के बारे में जो इतिहास पुरुष, दर्शन के इतिहास पुरुष के रूप में अभिनव, और मैं समझता हूँ कि जो इस प्रकार यानी अभिनव का भाषा शास्त्र, मैं तो साहब न तो भाषा के बारे में जानता हूँ, मैं न प्रमाण शास्त्र के बारे में, लेकिन कुछ थोड़ा बहुत मैं जब देख रहा था तो मैं चमत्कृत हो गया कि किस प्रकार से वो भाषा, तो सबसे बड़ी बात तो आप जानते हैं उनकी जो चेतना की जो परिकल्पना है वो वागात्मिका है। वो कहते चेतना यदि वाग्रूप नहीं है तो वो चेतना ही नहीं। तो ये मैं समझता हूँ कि इस दृष्टि से अध्ययन होना चाहिए। और मैं अरिंदम जी को बधाई भी देना चाहता हूँ और धन्यवाद इसलिए कि जब भी उनको सुनता हूँ तो मैं कुछ सीखता ही हूँ और मैं संपन्नतर होता हूँ। तो आई एम सो ग्रेटफुल टू यू। बहुत और तो बस मेरी मैं क्षमा चाहता हूँ कि मिलने जाने के बारे में मुझे कुछ भी नहीं मालूम है। आपके साथ है कि मैं सीखूंगा।
I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Navjeevan Rastogi, our guest of honor, for his incredible deliberation. Now with this, let's proceed to the ceremony of shawl giving. I would like to call upon Ms. Richa to hand over the shawl to Professor D.N. Yadav along with the kit bag.
Hello, am I audible? I would like to request that before I leave, I would like to listen to Inakshi's prepared whatever she was going to say about the theme of the conference, because partly my fault, we have moved away from Wittgenstein to completely to Abhinav Gupta, but we shouldn't forget.
Dr. Inakshi Revitra to get connected after this song.
Yes.
Ceremony, Dr. Inakshi Revitra from University of Delhi will deliver a talk about the concept note of the conference. Dr. Inakshi Revitra, please get connected in a couple of minutes.
Hello, Professor Pandey. Won't there be any question answer session on Professor Chakravarti's talk?
Maybe after your talk, Inakshi.
Okay.
Okay,
thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
I think I should make myself visible as well.
I think
just a second, Dr. Inakshi, just a second, let the shawl be presented. Yes, just a second.
I guess, Inakshi, I am getting an electronic shawl.
Ms. Sonakshi, please come on stage to hand over a shawl to Professor Navjeevan Rastogi, and also Ms. Ankita to hand over the shawl and the kit back to Professor H.S. Upadhyay. Now with this, I would like to invite Dr. Nakshi Mitra to present her views.
Thank you, everybody. I'm really abashed to say anything, after this, kind of fascinating talk by Professor Chakravarti. I have always thought about privacy, and particularly privacy, has been a very favorite notion of my field of interest with Wittgenstein. And I was always impressed that later Wittgenstein, the way he was trying to say the sensations are private it doesn't have any ontological correlate, but it's a paradigm of constructing or reading our sensations as recoiled into one's exclusive body space or one's own perspective. And along with this, since it is a paradigm, I didn't realize that emphasizing on it as a paradigm also implies that parallelly you can have an alternative paradigm. Just as you can recoil the outer into the inner, similarly you can also disperse the inner into the outer. And this was exactly what Professor Chakravarti had been doing, and parallelly with Abhinava Gupta, about whom I didn't know anything. And I have never thought in that way. I've thought that, okay, it is possible to disperse the inner, but the way he had done it, I was really mesmerized. And I had two questions which I'm, trying to, import here, that how would this view of generalizing the subjectivity, how would it handle the prapya karitva of indriyas? I mean, the touch and the skin. Yeah, the skin and the taste, the jubha. The prapya karitva of this, how that would be handled by this generalizing the subjectivity. Another is that there is always some kind of incurable notion of our body schema. There is though space is unreal, of course. Space is unreal. The talk of impenetrability of space also, we are learning we know how to grow out of it. But still, the fact that the objects or our feelings or whatever, it gets condensed around our body, exclusively condensed around our body, how will this be addressed? So whether Professor Chakravarti addresses these questions or not, that's a different point, but I may be thinking aloud, and I took this opportunity to place those questions. Anyway, now to go back to my concept, the theme of the conference. Just I will say a few things which had already been written in the concept note. First, let me start with by the time, how much time do I take, Professor Pandey's? 10 minutes? 10 to 12 minutes? Yes?
Yeah, sure. 10 minutes.
Okay. So yeah, I would like to, since there is always a tendency to discard any possibility of parallel engagements within Indian and Western systems, I would try to like to start with the Davidsonian confidence that to pose two styles of thought as being mutually untranslatable is, of course, at the same time placing them on a commensurable platform. But given the theme of our society, and particularly the theme of this year, we have to operate within certain cautions. Like we know that for both early and later Wittgenstein, he would not have any pre-linguistic point of origin of knowledge. And he, as far as I can understand, if I'm not mistaken, is none of his systems, none of his earlier or later phases would be having room for Nirvikalpaka Pratyaksha or any kind of cognition of the Svalakshanas. So any time of, particularly with later Wittgenstein, any talk of foundation of knowledge or of meaning, they have been sought to be ruled out, though in different manners, of course, in the two periods. Specifically in later philosophy, we find that any purportedly semantic primitive, they themselves demanded interpretations, the so-called memory images, as if with a claim that, look, we are embodying pastness into ourselves. That didn't have any sense for Wittgenstein. So naturally, the talk of smriti as revival of sanskaras, that had to be problematized. Then was the foundationalist program of knowledge to found knowledge on certain basic beliefs. This was kind of handled differently, because his hinge propositions, very interesting hinge propositions, like the earth exists, things don't systematically disappear when we are not looking. If someone's head is cut off, the person will be dead and not a live human being. Trees do not gradually change into men and men into trees. I'm a human being, I have forebears. They are explicitly constructed only as hindsights, and they do not have any fixed propositional content. They can only flesh out bit by bit and completely through our ongoing applications. So overall, later Wittgenstein believed in the primacy of action, that we all do. And his style of thought also did not accommodate a systematic construction of epistemology, that, you have different kinds of cognition and you have different kinds of pramanas. And incidentally, you see, Wittgenstein scholars, they need to develop, I don't know whether this has been developed to the fullest extent, but, a full-fledged account of sense perception, which we find in his philosophy of psychology, and also substantially in philosophical remarks. I do not know whether this has been developed adequately. This needs to be done in order to run meaningful parallel thoughts between the Wittgensteinian approach to sense perception and the Indian theories of sense perception. Nature of the sense organs, what would be Wittgenstein's stand according to the nature of the sense organs or motor organs, both. A quotation from PR, which is already given in the concept note, that shows that indicates that how Wittgenstein's view of sense perception had been radically inactive or proprioceptive. And yes, and I also some Wittgenstein commentators, they have said that Wittgenstein's inactive view of perception was rich enough to accommodate the neurological theories which were contemporary to his time. Like his view of perception was adequate enough to accommodate David Marr's neurological developments. Now, and in this perspective, I think that given this inactive nature of cognition, we can reflect that how it would differ from the causal model of the Nyaya-Vaisheshikas, for instance, that Indriyartha Sanikasha giving rise to Pratyaksha Prama. And it would be interesting to note that how actions that constitute the very ontology of perception and cognition in Wittgenstein, and which was actually thrown out as a peripheral anyatha siddhi in Nyaya-Vaisheshika theory of cognition and perception in particular. It was thrown out as anyatha siddhi, and it was given a status of a different category as karma. So that is interesting, one field to study. So in this connection, one can also look at the Nyaya-Vaisheshika theory of samartha pravritti janakatva, which and when we realize that though there is a pragmatic orientation in Wittgenstein's later philosophy, but it does that it rules out inferring the validity of the cognition from the samartha pravritti janaka. The Wittgenstein's style of thought would not allow that. So here it would be a relevant question to ask that would the Nayayikas say, though they have this samartha pravritti janakatva as providing the resources from which we can infer the validity of cognition, but how would it compare with Wittgenstein's claim that we bump our head against action and we say that explanations come to an end and this is what I do? Would the Nayayikas be prepared to say that? So one of the very original insights of later Wittgenstein, as we all know, and a very provocative insight of Wittgenstein, is that this internal relation between language and reality, and it comes up particularly in later thoughts as language being a sophisticated extension of our non-verbal behavior. So our non-verbal behavior, our primitive behavior, Professor Chakravarti had been talking about the simulative behavior of infants, that already has a conceptual orientation, that has a way of carving out the stable, unstable structure within each object and tracking non-repeatable individuals across different spatial locations. So this kind of spatial configuration or this kind of conceptual mobility or distributability is already there in our behaviors, and that itself, you see, thickens out into so-called verbal language. And naturally, that all, of course, shows us the key to discard private language. And if I'm not mistaken, this leads us to compare that the linguistic ubiquity, if I may use this term, the linguistic ubiquity of Wittgenstein versus the Indian linguistic ubiquity of the Vyakaranas, for example. I don't know much about, I don't know anything about the Vyakaranas, but whether, the linguistic ubiquity that both of them hold, whether they can be compared meaningfully and whether we can find out a common route through which both of them would be countering the Nayayika resistance to this, ubiquity of Shabda. With this backdrop, the different routes of comparison come up. I was always thinking that Wittgenstein's rejection of sense of reference in different ways in both his early period and the later period, and how we can bring in the notion of sense and reference in the Indian, theories of meaning, in the topic about Shakti, and whether the tussle that we have regarding Shakti, Vyakti Shaktivad, Jati Shaktivad, Akriti Shaktivad, etc., which these can be run together. Then Wittgenstein's notion of resemblance. Resemblance and analogy did come up in Sir's lecture, and I also find, at least one presentation which talks about, I think, sadrishya or resemblance in the Nayayika system as compared with, Wittgenstein's system, later Wittgenstein's approach. Then analysis of negative propositions, it is there, abhava absence, it is there in forthcoming presentations. Notion of I, notion of self, which Professor Chakravarti had already talked about. And given the fact that it was ineffable in practices and it became a kind of paradigm or a super referring game of I, in the PI, then treatment of memory, of course, I will be trying to handle a bit of it. Then certain other things which I don't see, but which we could expect of them to come in the forthcoming years, like treatment of propositions about a number, sankhya, the relation of paryapti in the Naya system, and the apeksha buddhi, how we can compare it with Wittgenstein's approach to number. Then Wittgenstein's treatment of elliptical sentences versus the Anvita Bhidhanvada and Abhita Anvayavada and the notion of Adhyahara. This can be another provocative area. Upamana and Upamiti, given the fact of the comparison and similarity. And we see many other fascinating topics coming up, like various areas of comparison with Buddhism, Wittgenstein and Shankara, knowledge and justification, Wittgenstein and Mimamsa. Professor Pandey himself has brought up the notion of, this certainty, the issue of certainty, comparing it with Jayanta Bhatta and Moore, Wittgenstein and Jainism. A very interesting paper I see, like epistemic operators and Wittgenstein, socially extended cognition. Here we can relate with what Professor Chakravarti had been talking about, like generalizing the privacy, generalizing the subjectivity, and many, many others. And I think that, we are going to have a very interesting and very stimulating sessions ahead. And I hope we can carry it on for the next years as well. So with that, I wind up my talk. Thank you.
Now, before I call Professor D. and Yadav upon the dais, I would like to pass on the mic to Professor Chandra sir for his insightful views.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think there are so many things which I also had Arindam been here, I would have liked clarification on that. The end was absolutely overwhelming, as is usually in all his papers and his presentations. And I could almost feel that it was a big section from Merleau-Ponty, as it were, this whole kind of opening yourself and the vulnerability of the self to the other, and in the context of a dialogue, or a Martin Buber in the Ida context and the others. Indeed, very, very grateful to Dr. Arindam Chakravarti for his absolutely fantastic educative paper. I am quite sure that we'll have very soon the paper to read. There were three very small things which I just wanted to put before the audience and also to Professor Chakravarti for some clarification for my own benefit. One was that towards the end, when you said that this idea of subjectivity, as it were, a universal subjectivity, as it were, is being the precondition, as it were, for conversation in the dialogue. That may be well taken as a precondition, but then the subsequent question that whether I have got you right in those conditions, what the Buddhist said, parachittavatti duranvaya, it's difficult to know the parachittavatti in a specific context. So how do I know the other person's chittavritti in a particular utterance? Will there be conditions like the Nyayic state? And will there be conditions in Abhinav as well? The second would be the same kind of a question to myself, whether I have got my own chittavritti right in this particular statement, would that be done? This would not be sorted out just by the acceptance of a general subjectivity framework, as it were, in terms of conversation. Because that, I think, is the general framework of all communication intention theory, as against the pure formal semanticist theory. The other difficulty which I keep on wondering is that when we now take the huge scope of taking the neurolinguists, as well as the artificial intelligence people, as well as the psychologists and the philosophers and the aestheticians together, I find it a little worrisome that what would be the methodological position that we take as philosophers. Because as we were trained at one time, where our discipline, in its own modesty, would be an a priori discipline which would not venture into empirical inquiry, not because it's inferior, but because we are not prepared and we do not have the wherewithal to deal with that. Now, in this broad scope, what do we bring from ourselves and what is the methodology that we use? That's the second thing which I was worrying. And you were taking very expansively from theory people to the simulation theorists to the autistic theory, empirical investigation, all of that together with the good old Kant. And the third thing which I was worrying, and again, I think you would be the best person to tell me how to take that. The first critique of Kant does give us the transcendental unity of a perception as a presupposition. It also gives us the necessity of having an external substance in space and time as a presupposition of understanding. But in the first critique, to my mind, the other subject is almost absent. There is no account from in the first section or the second section or the third section that there is the other. Of course, my colleague Dr. Rajini Srivastava and the others were telling me that the second and the third critique would not be possible unless they're the other. But in the first critique, it does not seem possible. So how do we do that? That seems to be one big question that we have. And the fourth question, which I think is that what does Wittgenstein bring to our understandings of theories of language in the Indian context, whether in the Nyayics? Can the Nyayics learn something from Wittgenstein? Can the Abhinav story learn something from Wittgenstein? Or maybe the other way around, that maybe he could have, because as you said, that in certain cases he does not have that resource with the Indian thing. Because again, from early Wittgenstein to later Wittgenstein, there's one oversimplified version where we say that, from formal semanticist picture of the Tractatus, he moves to the more conversational implication theory in later in Wittgenstein, and then the remarks that we have in which we try to read almost everything in the world. That he also said that, he also said that. So I was wondering that what do we learn from that? Of course, what I'm commenting is asking for too many things, but nonetheless, this general feeling I generally always have that if we take the conditionality of cosmic subjectivity as a framework of reference for conversation, it is absolutely well-founded and it takes care of many things. But it does not then answer the further questions on which the Naics and the Mimamsakas have given a great detailed account of how to interpret another person's correct statement about their self-reporting and the others. Because the first person singular infallibility will not come from the acceptance of a general subjectivity as a framework of reference for a language theory. But Arindam, it's a pleasure, it's a great pleasure, and I am extremely unhappy that we are not face to face. But absolutely a great pleasure to listen to you always. Thank you so much.
I would like to very briefly respond to Rakesh and Enakshi and then take your leave because it's getting late. I have to cook and make dinner and have dinner. It's going to be 10 o'clock soon. But I have looked at all the abstracts and all, they're great. And let me start with Rakesh's point. Can I, sorry, I should have taken permission to do that. Can I go ahead and respond to the two of them?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yes, if universal subjectivity is a necessary precondition, so the way it is deployed in Abhinavagupta, he gives a transcendental argument. His agenda is to prove that there has to be a single self. But it's a very subtle way of doing the single self because the variety of the different embodied persons is not denied. It is not an illusion as in Shankara's Advaita. And the importance of the difference between me and Rakesh, between Rakesh and Enakshi, between Enakshi and Navjeevan Rastogi, between Navjeevan Rastogi and Rafael Torella, these are all distinctions are extremely important. Why? Because from the ratio cognoscenti, we don't see the oneness. We can only transcendentally argue that the only condition under which successful communication is possible across distinct dialogue partners, across distinct actors and responders. And as Navjeevanji very importantly said, not just speech, every human action is taken as an action which is meaningful only in the nexus of possible responses from others. So there the otherness is extremely important. Now, given that, Rakesh is absolutely right. So how do I ever know? Have I got the other person right? And then Rakesh, with his typical deepening of the question, has also, I think, suggested, how can I even be sure that I've got myself right? Now, both of these questions, at least, can be opened up. Abhinav Gupta is not saying that he said the last word. Okay. He is more like the later Wittgenstein than like Mahabharata and earlier tractators, that all the problems of philosophy are solved in this. Whatever is here is elsewhere, whatever is not here is nowhere. It's not like that. He himself, at the end of his largest book, Vivid Universe, says If you can tap onto this resource, which is the source of all successful communication and a practical life of transaction, Janastiti Loka Vyavahara, you can know the truth for yourself. That's how he ends the book. Satyam Swayam Jnasya. There can be future. And he calls this in the Abhinav Bharati, Viveka Sobhana Parampara, that there is a staircase on which I have put you all in. And I have depended upon previous, Abhinav says, previous philosophers. I have improved their view, but somebody can improve my view too. And in this, the most important is I have to accept a lot from my opponents. Explicitly he says, Purvapaksha Madhyat Asmabhir Bahu Angi Kartavyam. We have to accept many things from the Yogachar Buddhist, from the Swaprakar, the theory of Swasambhiti, from the theory of Prakara Vijnanavad and so on. But a small answer, a brief answer to the question, how do I correct my mistakes in interpreting others? Answer. Conversation. So here is a little bit of my sort of Gandhian interpretation of the possibility of conflict and conflict resolution. Never to stop the channels of dialogue. Dialogue with oneself, correcting. It is significant that when it comes to addressing oneself, when it comes to addressing others, Abhinavagupta takes the example of extreme erotic love and he says, Daita, oh my darling, Daita, Tvameva Ahamasmi, I am you. But when it comes to talking to himself, he takes the small example. It's very significant. He takes Dhikmam, Kayam. That means just because there is one subjectivity, I am not supposed to say I am everything, I've got everything right. What I say is the truth. It's the opposite of that. It's by constant self-correction and by constant dialogue with others. So that's my delineation of the first. Rakesh raised many other points which I would not even try. But I wish that all the Wittgenstein scholars go deep into Wittgenstein and find responses to that. And I'll just give two examples of that from Inakshi's question. Inakshi, you know that we don't study it too much, but when I taught for the last 20 years Wittgenstein, I make them do, and some of my PhD students have worked on this. Wittgenstein, in a collection now available in English, wrote these lectures and gave these lectures, which are called Lectures on Language of Sense Data and Private Experience, notes by Rush Rees. You can find them in that very easily available Hackett book called Philosophical Occasions. So there you will see Wittgenstein trying to struggle with the concept of different sense organs and touch and all. And just to give one answer to how potentially explosive this research direction can be. And Inakshi's, I'm very proud of her, because instead of asking Wittgensteinian questions to Indian philosophy, she's asking, as we should, Indian philosophical questions to Wittgenstein to understand him better. Not to question him, is he as sophisticated as the Nyayikas? But the way to best understand is not to get bogged down into secondary literature. Of course, Bacon and Hacker we should read. We should read Anscombe. We should read, Fogelin. We should read all the Wittgenstein scholars. But we should not also forget to read Sachin Gangopadhyay. And Inakshi herself has written, upon my request, an excellent detailed piece on the contribution of Sachin Gangopadhyay to Wittgenstein because of his book on the introduction to the Tractatus. So here is the explosive suggestion with which I will end. Meenakshi has asked, what about Prapyakaritva? Okay. She has asked many questions like, is Wittgenstein a Parata Pramanyavadi? Okay. How would he explain, the Indian philosophical issues of Anvita, Bidhana, Bidhanma? But one question, what is the concept of sense organ? Do sense organs go out and do they have an active, or are they passive like Kant's, transcendental aesthetic? The sensibility is completely passive and receptive. But you are right. Since concepts and the tools of understanding are part of the faculty of activity in Kant, and Wittgenstein and Abhinavagupta is very elusive about this. But it has become clear to me now that, like me, Abhinavagupta also denies non-conceptual perception, which surprises us because all the mystical interpreters have said ultimately it is all nirvikalpa perception, but ordinary perception of objects, even nameless, non-linguistic, any sensory activity has to be harnessed with some grids of conceptual requirement. In this sense, senses have to be active. And he can say this easily because of an esoteric tantric doctrine, which is also a Vedic doctrine, an Upanishadic doctrine, that once they are generalized, sensory faculties are devatas. They are our divinities. And sensory faculties can teach us. In fact, they can teach us reasoning. So the big reason experience dichotomy is busted. It is collapsed and lifted away. How so? Because of Abhinavagupta. And this is why mirror neurons, that's how I got into thinking about them in the context of Abhinavagupta. Not so much about other minds. But Abhinavagupta has this doctrine: seeing, touching, smelling, hearing, tasting, especially tasting. They all function by mirroring. And one absolutely earth-shaking thing that he urges us to notice, that in every mirroring, something is reversed. Like in visual mirroring, left and right is reversed. Similarly, he says, nobody can passively taste sweetness or bitterness unless something is returned by the tongue, which he calls salivation. And salivation is dantodaka in Vivriti Vimarshini. So we return back. He said, unless the auditory nerves, and he doesn't say nerves, he said, unless our Shravanendriya, our sense organ of hearing, had some mirroring device, and he calls that pratishrudka, echoing, returning the sound by the sound. No sound can be grasped unless a counter return sound is offered back. No color can be seen unless the visual organ itself returns a color. Before rushing to compare it with neuroscience, we have to first understand what he's saying. There is a mirroring, active theory of sense data reception. It is not. So, since the word datum means that which is given, nothing can be given unless something is given back. That's his theory of sense organ. And I think Wittgenstein would be happy to consider that. That's all.
So thank you, sir. Thank you for delivering such wonderful response to questions. And we are grateful to you, sir, Professor Arindam Chakravarti. And we request you to accept our invitation in future as well. In future as well, we would like to give some trouble to deliver the lecture, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay.